Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks. Zahra, you're going to stay with me while we go to our last session. I just want to
You've
clarify.
done a full day, Mary. Wow, this is amazing.
I know we've just done another half hour, and you can see that the room is filling with some venerable types. Just saying, of a certain age and a certain gender. I'm noticing. We made every effort to make today as representative as we possibly could. And when I looked at the program, I realized that I had a certain dominance here of a representation in our last session. So gentlemen, we're appreciative that we don't necessarily have every voice at the table. I also just want to clarify that the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion made every effort to be on this platform, and it was our fail, not his, that he was not able to get on. So I see Abby Slater there speculating that the minister may have tried to dodge. He did not, in fact. He made every effort, and we were accommodating, as you guys know, a question period and caucus and various things. So, and as I always say to these ministers, you know, we're not losing their number. And I know that I've got here on this call a bunch of people who will have lots of opportunity to talk to Minister Hassan going forward into 2023. We've had a fantastic 4.5 hours. You are our cleanup act, Michael, Michel, Chief McFee and Anna. And we're very appreciative to have you help us sort of orient ourselves for the next 1,000 days. We've had a tour de force of sessions highlighting important lessons and some really key words and concepts and directions around urgency, focus, resources, leveraging public infrastructure for the public good. This notion that nobody's in charge and everybody's in charge, that we need policy to move at the speed of the problem, that we've got a polarization challenge and a social capital challenge, and surely isn't placemaking and city building part of the response to that? How do we do community safety differently? We had one of your colleagues on earlier, Chief McFee, Peter Slowly was on midday. And I would say the one key thing that I hear again and again is how do we create really effective architectures of collaboration? Because during this urgent period, this emergency period, we suddenly found a way to work together as we had to. And I see Chief McFee giving me the thumbs up. And how are we going to sustain that? So maybe I'll go to you first, Chief, because we appreciate you all coming in from different parts of the country and different perspectives. The next 1,000 days, what do you think our priorities should be? Go to you first, Chief McFee.
Yeah, well, first of all, Mary, thanks, and always appreciate the invite. I think you touched on it. I listened to a little bit of the last panel, and I think it's really forced us to do things differently. And the reality is if we don't do this in partnerships, in collaboration, we're not going to have the ecosystem that we need to be successful. And right now, if anybody thinks that Canada has an ecosystem, especially on the social side, to survive and to thrive, we're fundamentally wrong. When you look at the housing file, you look at obviously the relationship with mental health addictions, you can't talk about well-being without safety. But really what this really is how do you form the right partnerships with equal measurements set on the same goals to achieve success? We're starting to do that in various parts of the country. We cannot lose that. This isn't about moving money around. This is about putting the right resources to get the solutions connected to a problem at the earliest opportunity. All these people that are trying to say move money, let's say police to social services or social service to health, that has never worked and never will. What really works is when you put partnerships, you get a common goal, a common vision, and you actually try to help people by having the full picture. So police have part of it. I always like the fact that health has the ability to engineer public health. Police have the ability to reverse engineer. The reality is if we get that right, we also help social services and we help the education system. So I think the need for data sharing, we've gotten better at that. That needs to be expanded, has to be quickly. And then I think we can't forget about the urgency that this is actually created. So I'll give you an example. A year into COVID, we brought in a psychologist and he gave us a prediction of what's going to happen. He told us domestic violence was going to go up. He told us child abuse is going to go up. He said mental health and addictions are going to go off the chart. He told us that gun violence is got a really strong chance of going up. And he said officer mental wellness is going to deteriorate rapidly. That's the same in nursing. That's the same in EMS. We're seeing it in our teachers. We have to build that resilience on the frontline essential services here. And we have to do that. And we have to get away from the rhetoric of everybody pointing the fingers at them when they're out there doing their very best to do their job. So we need to move towards these actions quickly. But I think we've never been positioned better than we have. And we need to use the next 1,000 days to really entrench some of these in sound policy and sound implementation, but not just theory. It has to have an implementation in relation to it, and has to have a practical application on the ground. So I'll turn it over to somebody else. I try to go as quick as I could, Mary.
You did just fine. I hear you about the rhetoric. I think we're all tired of the blah, 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 right? It's a big dilemma. I'm going to go to Anna Bailão next, who's probably enjoying the fact that she doesn't have to cope with quite so much blah, 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 since she's no longer on a city council. But there's still lots of blah, blah in your future, Anna, I'm sure, in whatever your new role is, but you're coming in as a fellow at CUI. We're very appreciative of that. And you have very specific experience from many years of serving on a city council. So what's your perspective for the next 1,000 days?
I think it's going to be extremely important to find common ground. I think looking back, you know, everybody knows that change has always happened, but through COVID, you know, changing came at all of us at a crazy speed. And people were like, well, this is a lot of change. It created a lot of anxiety, a lot of fears out there. But it also revealed a lot of cracks that our systems had, right? And people said, well, we know that there's certain issues out there that are worse than ever before, but we know that during COVID, we were able to do things differently. And so why do we need to go back to the same old? Like, why not? Why can't people work from home? Why not? Right? People are quite asking those questions. And the other thing is, we've been able to answer to some things in the speed of light. I mean, an example, City of Toronto put some modular homes in 6 months, they put it together, and people are saying, why don't you do more of that? Why aren't you responding to that? So I think that's what happened. This is what we're dealing with, that polarization that you just talked about. It's because of all this that happened. And now I feel like we need to bring all this, recognize this, say, yes, there is polarization. We need to do things quicker. We need to do things differently. We need to address this change. But we need to find that common ground so we bring people together. And I think there is common ground in a lot of issues. Like I'm going to obviously talk about housing, right? Like when you talk about housing, and if you start saying, well, let's have as a common ground that it's a right to housing, that we are, whatever we do, whatever policies we put in place, it is to put a roof over somebody's head. It is to give them the opportunity to have a home. If you start from that principle, and again, I don't think anybody's going to dispute that, right? Every Canadian is going to say, yes, let's rally around that goal. You bring people and you focus people. And I think we need to do more of that in a lot of files, to have these common grounds that people all sometimes think, oh, those are lofty goals. No, but you need to rally and to focus and to have some common principles around some of these files. I think will be really important to take that polarization that is very concerning.
How do we drive the focus?
How do we?
Other than urgency, like urgency drove a focus, but now if the urgency is lifted, how do you think we should drive a focus? And then I'm going to come back.
I think the urgency is very clear on a number of files. You talk about mental health, housing issue. I mean, if we need to drive urgency into any of these things, okay. I think what we need to do, especially around governments and politicians, right now it's very polarizing, and we know. As a recently out of politics person, politicians are very averse to the risk, right? But if they see that there's that common goal, and I think that it's on us, it's on all of us to bring that common goal and to bring them to the table as well, and to say, this needs to be the focus of this policy. Let's work around these common goals. I think it'll be really important. We really need to bring people together and to remove a little bit of this polarization. It's very different. I mean, on the housing file, look at the federal and provincial government. They're like, it's.
I know, and I know that Michael Emery is dying to get into that, but I want to go next to Michel because Michel, you are bringing a focus in terms of downtown Montreal, and I'm interested if you can give us some tips about that. I know I cannot imagine that you're going to let up on that, and that is going to be your focus for 2023. Is how do we actually bring back the downtown? Am I right? Or have you got a few other things that you're going to focus on as well?
Well, first, I come from an economic perspective, so I hear a lot coming from the housing or social issues. And of course, we can feel them in Montreal and as elsewhere. But first, the economic momentum is very strong in Quebec and in the Montreal area. So I'm now on record saying that In French, it's la COVID long, so it's the long COVID. So the downtown has a long COVID.
Right.
The rest of the economic system has moved on. So right now, the only moment when we are going to discuss special measures here related to the COVID is the downtown. Now, at this moment, what we see is that the downtown is weakened because the employers are not calling back their employees as much as they want. When we poll the employees here, they say on average they'd like to work at the office 2 to 3 days a week. When we poll the employers, it's 3 to 4 days a week. So it's not a big difference. I mean, right. We suspect that over the next year, the balance will happen. The equilibrium will be reached. Now, it has an impact also on the surface that's needed, which means the occupation rate is high. And we have Michael here. Clearly, over the next months, we're going to look at the downsizing of space. So therefore, are we able to attract new small businesses that would not have been downtown? So are we attracting what I call in French running shoes type of business people as opposed to the necktie type of business? So we're kind of trying, and I think Michael is trying to do that, is how do we renew the dynamics of the downtown with new types of businesses and workers? From a downtown perspective, that's the key. From a global economic perspective, we're focused on labor shortage. There might be inflation, which is a problem for a whole generations of business people who have never known that type of inflation. Clearly, the dynamics of a potential small recession, where in Quebec, there's a strong consensus that if there is a recession, it's going to be very mild, not that long. So the real focus is, even if there's a recession, there's so many unfulfilled jobs that laid off people will find a job, sometimes in the same business, same companies, or sometimes elsewhere. But so the dynamics of a recession where people lose their job, reduce consumption, and increase the recession, unlikely to happen here. So it's really labor shortage. And when we think about labor shortage, it brings us back to the housing thing. Now, in Montreal, honestly, if we compare notes and numbers with Vancouver, with Toronto, with elsewhere in Canada, we're not in such a housing crisis as elsewhere in the country. But whenever we talk about immigrants as a potential part of the solution for the labor shortage, then we run into housing shortage in Montreal and elsewhere in Quebec. So I suspect that over the next months to a year, there'll be a policy by the Quebec government, and clearly, ideally, linked with a national policy about housing. And it's about supply. It's about opening the doors to more supply. You can try and subsidize housing as much as you want to make it affordable, but if there's not enough housing out there, then the markets will play. So really, from a Montreal perspective, it's the downtown. The economic sectors are strong. The batteries, artificial intelligence, all the other sectors are strong. Labor shortage is key, and linked to labor shortage is housing and housing strategies.
Got it. Thank you, Michel. Great to see you. And always important to have Montreal in the conversation. Michael, I know you have an interest in Montreal. You have an interest in Toronto. You are across the country. And your sector has been deeply engaged in a lot of these conversations, as you just heard your colleagues talk about the kind of disruption we're in the midst of which COVID is really only just one part. But I'm wondering, if you were to think about the next 1,000 days, what do you think the priority needs to be?
Well, Mary, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's great to be on a panel with the other distinguished guests. I really do appreciate that. As you know, I'm an incurable optimist. I was born that way, and I'll die that way, and I'll enjoy the interim as much as I can. I think the foundation for the next 1,000 days was established years and years ago in major Canadian cities. So I'm very confident about the next 1,000 days. And in saying that, I truly am not diminishing or ignoring any of the problems that have arisen over the last 2 or 3 years in the inner city of major Canadian cities. I'm acutely aware of them. And I do think a concerted effort needs to be undertaken to address those issues. But the foundation for that exists. And what is the foundation for that? In my opinion, it is the fact that all of Canada's major cities have evolved into mixed-use urban environments. People live in the urban core, in some cases to an extreme degree, which is good. People work in the urban core, in some cases to an extreme degree, which is good. Retail users have come into the urban core in an unprecedented way to serve the populations that have built up around those other two uses. So they are quite literally mutually reinforcing mixed uses. And this isn't my wisdom I'm sharing. This is Jane Jacobs' wisdom, which I have seen play out in Canadian cities ever since I've been in the real estate business. And it's played out exactly.
Well, and Michael, it's interesting you mentioned Jane, because Jane was involved in the rethinking of the zoning in the Kings areas in Toronto, which you actually were one of the early developers of, to really, and I bet you had naysayers at the beginning that said, oh, no, people won't want to go and work in those buildings, but you've proven it to be true, they will. So do you think we'll see a similar kind of metamorphosis as maybe we just shift uses somewhat in the core, in the downtowns?
Absolutely. And you know what's happened, and it's very interesting because I live this on the ground.
Yeah.
We have learned to live together collaboratively.
Right.
Residential users instinctively hate office users. I don't want to stop my statement.
Not all of them.
And vice versa. But what's happened, and they really dislike commercial users, especially if they make noise or emit odors or what have you. But what's happened, and I've seen it and I've lived it, is these different users of a shared area of real consequence learn to live with one another and actually to give where necessary and take where necessary. And I'm not suggesting we're living in a panacea, because we're clearly not. But we have learned to collaborate to make the urban environment better for everyone.
So it's interesting, you say we probably have a handful of examples where that's working very well. And then we have other communities that perhaps are struggling a bit, like the city of Ottawa, for instance, where it was predominantly public sector office workers, and it's now in transition. And I'm wondering if I can go back to Chief McFee for a sec. One of the things that we hear talked about, and Michel made reference to this, are we going back to the office as frequently? Is the cadence of travel different? Or is Michael suggesting, will we actually find more people living closer to their office? We are hearing from certain parts of downtowns, Dale, that they are, that the policing is not as effective as the vendor community would like it to be. And does that mean that we do need to resource differently so that people feel safe and that they feel like they can, in fact, move into the downtowns that Michael's busy advocating that people move back into?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I mean, visibility matters, right? So visibility is one of the deterrents. So absolutely we need to, because I just want to I'm going to switch my hat of police chief to the entrepreneur, because when Michel and Michael and Anna mentioned, I think we're missing the point here, or something we should flesh out. It's all about the economy. You lose the tax base downtown, who pays for the other side of the issue? And I mean, there's a domestic economy, which we all know about, but then there's a social economy. But as you put this in, one is bringing in revenue, the other is expending. And if you don't make it a net economy, like, would you rather have a $500 million business that loses $100 million or a $5 million that makes $1 million? The point being here, the real value that we saw in COVID exposing some of this is to connect the two and actually focus on things that actually work. And that's where I think the domestic economy, the private sector can really come in and play a role as we start to look at this differently. For instance, for us, we've hired epidemiologists, economists, mathematicians, psychologists. These are all in my police service. They're
all working for you. That's where we're going.
But think about this. When we talk about creating jobs and we want to bring in immigration, which is absolutely necessary. But what if we got 20% of the jobs from the people that aren't working, the people that are on the streets, and we actually do a reverse and we get somebody, for lack of better words, that's vulnerable, maybe a tax user, and turn them into a taxpayer by putting a percentage of those jobs in that. You can't get them all, but there's certainly a percentage. We don't have targets, we don't get there. So I think our biggest opportunity is to stop separating these questions and put them together. And that's how you'll create a safer downtown as well. We need the private sector here as much as we need everybody else. And it's changing, but the changing goes back to the premises. If you don't feel safe, you're not going to move into any neighborhood, regardless of where it is, downtown or on the far south side here or anything. And that's what we got to figure out as a formula, which is, I think, what you're referring to.
It's a place-based conversation and very specific to places. I hear you. Anna, I want to go to you quickly. It's no longer something that keeps you up at night, but I know you know this to be true. What's going to happen to municipal budgets in 2023? How are we going to get services paid for?
It's going to be a difficult conversation. I think taxes are going to go up more than people are used to. I mean, in the city of Toronto, you had increases at the rate of inflation, but inflation used to be much, much lower. So I think people are going to most likely see, 6, 7, depending on how the provincial and federal government's going to come in, maybe even more tax increase. And the challenge continues, but it's continued for a long time. And, this is another issue that it's probably time that our other orders of government have a conversation about the governance of our large cities, and in particular the city of Toronto.
Do you think it's time to have that conversation? And not
it was time a long time ago.
I know. But, let's hope they don't have it without you. Let's hope they have it with you. Michelle, thoughts for you as you go forward into the sort of mixed economy that Quebec is and that Montreal is. You're getting reinforcement from your pals here that it's all about the economy.
Well, I'm sure of that. So I'm an economist by training, so I learned that earlier. For us, clearly, the downtown is key. And the message we're pitching is that you cannot run a company from Lac-Memphremagog or Mont-Tremblant, where many CEOs will spend their weekend normally. And the dynamic is that we believe that thriving businesses will be businesses of contact, where people are in the traffic, where people meet. So it becomes, it's not only you bring people because you want a commercial base in the downtown to be alive, you bring people because you want companies, decision makers, to be confronted with other ideas, with their colleagues, with their advisors, with anyone who is at the downtown. So we make it as, we believe that downtown existed over centuries because it made sense from a large organization point of view. And we believe that's going to be the point next year and the year after. But if downtown become unsafe, if the commercial base decline, then you'll have a negative spiral that might happen. So our view, and we're very active, and in Quebec, the particularity we had is we have a provincial government that spent over $60 million. Through the chambers, we're talking about near 15 million over the last year and a half, with campaign, with initiatives to bring back the workers. So there's clearly a statement by the provincial government, not just by the city, that the downtown is key and important, and we need to allow resources to spend resources to bring people back. And the intent is to continue over the next year. And I'm like Michael, I'm the eternal optimist, pragmatic optimist. And I think we're going to succeed because it makes sense. But again, Chief McFee, we need to make sure it's perceived as a safe place. If it's not safe, then economically it will make sense, but it will be much more difficult.
It's always good to have good to have a panel of optimists. Go ahead, Zahra.
I've just been sitting here listening, which is like a new practice for me, but I have a question for all of you. I know we're limited on time, but Michael, you were talking about being the eternal optimist, and Dale, you were talking about, working with epidemiologists and psychologists and absorbing new wisdom or wisdom from new places. And I'm so curious. We have 143 people listening in who are in leadership roles in different ways across the country, all of you in leadership roles across the country. What shifted about the way that you lead in this change over the last 1,000 days personally? Like, Dale, I've heard so much, and maybe we start with you, because I feel like I've heard a lot of that from you, and I'm interested to hear quickly from each of you, because I think as we send everyone out into the change-making, city-building diaspora, it's really good to know in your leadership, what was challenged and how did you behave differently? Because I think that's part of what we need to take away in our individual sort of roles in city.
It's a great question, Zahra. And for us, we started to change the way we actually did community safety policing before COVID and before George Floyd. I think those two events actually allowed us to expedite it. The unfortunate part is we got sidetracked by, as Mary put, a lot of the noise and not focusing on the results. It's really about outcomes and evidence-based decision-making to actually do it. And for us, because we're the person of last resort, don't say no being policing, it's kind of why I came back, is you have to make that first point of contact, that first call for service meaningful. And really, we've created a whole new bureau, which is designed to take patrol and investigative service out of business. But really, it's about getting the right partnerships in our community to expand the base, to stop the first call from being the 5th call, the 10th call, the 20th call, the 50th call. So we've managed to shift and change. And then police leaders in cities have two, I think, distinct things that they need to be involved in. Obviously, there's the voice of authority, maintaining law and order and stuff, but there's also the voice of influence. We're not elected, and we need our civic folks, our not-for-profits, we need them all to become one team if we're going to be successful. And success is, back to what we were talking about, creating a safe environment, but also an environment where presence and safety are at the forefront, but it's all about turning that into economic viability, livable cities. That's been our strategies from day one. We get sidetracked and criticized and questioned a lot because a lot of it becomes noise, but it's allowed us to actually get that platform to do it. And for us, it's about finding the right partners in the community that we can do it with. There's a lot of partners. Give you one example and I'll shut up here. We have a major domestic violence problem, which is expedited by COVID. We have 140 agencies working in that area, and it's still our single biggest problem. Surely we can collaborate and coordinate that better to get better results. And that's just an example. And there's a bunch of them, but I think those are the things that it's allowed us to do.
Amazing. I don't know if anyone else, Anna, I'm curious about you. You're in a different role. So what's your wisdom?
I mean, I'll speak about what happened in my last role. I think that one key difference over the last couple of years was really this idea of the Team Toronto. And it worked, as we came out and, you saw people to get anything from vaccines, but it was entrenched. We worked with United Way to have our social service agencies together and dispersed and targeting different geographic areas. We worked, with our housing partners to be much closer to the need was great to come together. And I think now as a response and to say, we can't go back to the same, we want to address these systemic issues. We need to find that galvanizing force to bring us together again. So I think that it worked really well during COVID and response to this major crisis. And I think we need to capitalize on that and learn how to create this momentum to respond to crises that were here and that are just in some cases worse and others. I'm also an optimistic. I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but there are crises that I think are very visible and people are demanding, and in my opinion, rightly so, that we respond in a more urgent way.
I want quick last words to Michel and Michael, both of whom come from industry and from the economy side. Michel, a last word from you. I know labor supply is what you're focused on in the recession. Anything else you want to add?
Well, maybe to answer Zahra's question, the major change that I implemented was to delegate to a group of people decision-making that initially would have involved me. So maybe it's a trajectory that any CEOs or leader eventually get to, which is to delegate the real decision-making power, but not to individuals by themselves, but to groups of individuals. And by doing that, I think we reach better decisions. There's more expertise involved in making that decision. So it's an humble process that leads to you understanding that sometimes you make mistakes by your own self, and others as a group are more efficient and more intelligent than you are. So that's my taking of the COVID.
Michael, the last word to Michael.
Well, thank you. The experience I've had in the last 3 years reinforced my extremely deep conviction that leadership needs to be humanistic, it needs to be intensely personal, and it needs to be courageous. And in my sincere opinion, and without ending on a negative note, our political leaders have not demonstrated leadership over the past 3 years, and I think they need to. Some of the business community has neglected to demonstrate leadership over the past few years, and they need to step up. The people on this panel have all stepped up, but that's what I learned about leadership over the past 3 years. It really reinforced what I deeply believed, and it convinced me beyond any doubt that we need to interact in person, physically present with one another, if we're going to achieve anything approaching the level of achievement we're capable of.
Right. Well, on that very prophetic note, Michael, you know, I always remember the famous quote, you know, I don't know whose it is. It takes a lot to kill a city. You know, cities are unbelievably resilient. They have lasted for millennia. They will continue to last. You are all part of that extraordinary collaborative experiment that we're embarking on. So I just want to thank you for helping us to just round the session up. Each of you is playing a role in the Canadian Urban Alliance for Robust Recovery, which is launching today and will work through 2023 on very specific action agenda items for the federal, provincial, and municipal governments, and for our colleagues in the private sector, the community sector, civil society, because as we've heard again and again and again, this is one big collaborative experience and adventure we're on. So may I thank Dale. Nice to see you again. Michelle, always great. And I know I'm going to see you next week in person. Anna, whatever's next for you, we're excited. We know that you will continue to serve the public interest. And Michael, I know you're just blocks away. I could call out my window and you and I would hear each other. And we appreciate the leadership that you're providing to the industry to get engaged in solving these kind of collective challenges. And Zahra, always great to have you on with us. So thanks for joining us. I'm going to keep the audience on for one more minute just to do this. And our panelists can leave if they need to. I want to thank all of our staff that have been working for the last 1,000 days in a tireless way. And there's a slideshow that will follow that will show you how many staff, students, interns that have helped make the Canadian Urban Institute be of service to the urban and city building community through COVID. The second thing is we've had a remarkable leadership from the board. Zahra's on the board, Marcy's on the board. My board chair is sitting behind me in the office behind us here. He just brought me a piece of pizza, bless him. And I also want to thank all of our funders and our donors and our underwriters. Again, on a slideshow that will follow here, you'll be able to see them. And really, when you look at these slides, folks, just appreciate how diverse and broad our urban city building constituency is in this country. It is a remarkable force, and we are connected horizontally, working collectively to come up with the best solutions and the best experience and build that sense of urban empathy that we've been talking about for the last 5 hours. And then all the people that have come on City Talks and have come on consultations we've done, helped us write reports, helped us engage with different entities that are making decisions across the country. You're in the tens of thousands. It's a really significantly important constituency for the future of the country. And so I want to thank you for being part of that. And then you'll also see that we have dedicated this whole observance, and we will continue to replay it, to one of our board members who was on the COI board for many years and died this year. Kathleen Llewellyn-Thomas worked for four municipalities in various capacities. And we think of her and the inspiration that she provided to city builders across the country. And it's been a privilege for me to be with you again and learn so much from the city building community that is part of the Canadian Urban Institute. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to my staff and my colleagues and all of us that helped put today together. And we appreciate you coming on the journey with us. Bye-bye.